Picture this. You are walking into a grand ancient courtroom. The defendant sitting at the table, the mighty Roman Empire itself. And the prosecutor, St. Augustine of Hippo. In today's Explainer, we're going to unpack one of the absolute most fascinating takedowns in classical history. We are digging into Augustine's brilliant critique to figure out if Rome's ancient gods and their highly praised civic virtues actually protected the empire from disaster, or if that entire moral foundation was really just a spectacular illusion. All right, let's dive right into this. Right around the time Augustine was putting ink to parchment, the city of Rome had just been sacked, and the remaining pagans in the empire, well, they were pointing fingers. Their core accusation was that the rise of Christians and everyone abandoning the old polytheistic gods was exactly what caused Rome's fall. But Augustine turns around and asks a really simple, incredibly sharp rhetorical question. If the Roman gods were so powerful, where were they when Rome was burning? Seriously, where were they during the centuries of intense suffering before Christianity even existed? To really wrap our heads around Augustine's argument, we're going to follow a quick roadmap. 1. The grand Roman illusion. 2. The hypocrisy of the gods. 3. The lust for sovereignty. 4. Peace vying with cruelty. And 5. The final verdict. Okay, Section 1. The grand Roman illusion. Here we're examining the myths of divine protection before Christianity. So the pagan argument was basically that neglecting the gods brought on physical ruin. But Augustine, he literally brings out the historical receipts. He points out that pagan Rome suffered horrific famines, rampant pestilence, endless war, pillage, and massacre long before Christianity even existed. The exact bodily disasters pagans were trying to blame on Christians were in reality constant fixtures throughout Rome's early, fiercely pagan history. Ancient populations were regularly decimated by disease and starvation while they were out there actively sacrificing to Jupiter and Mars. The gods afforded them absolutely zero relief. Moving right along to Section 2, Hypocrisy of the Gods. Let's look at the double standards of Roman morality and divine justice. Take Troy, for example, Rome's ancient mother city. According to Roman myth, the gods abandoned Troy to burn as a direct punishment for Paris's adultery and Laomedon's perjury. They supposedly demanded absolute moral purity. But contrast that with Rome itself. Here is a city famously founded on Romulus murdering his own brother in a fit of rage, a horrific fratricide. And on top of that, Roman mythology is completely packed with divine adultery from Venus to Jupiter. So how exactly does divine justice burn one city for adultery, but bless and sponsor another that's founded on murder and populated by adulterous gods? Augustine sets this perfect logical trap. He writes, "If they believe their fables, let them blush to worship such gods. If they discredit the fables, let no more be said of the Trojan perjury." It's a brilliant corner to back them into. You simply can't have it both ways. You cannot claim your gods are strict moral arbiters, while they actively commit and reward the exact same crimes they supposedly punish. Which brings us to Section 3, the lust for sovereignty. We are deconstructing the sanitized mask of imperial greed. What the Romans praised as their absolute highest virtue, their glorious pursuit of empire and expansion, was to Augustine not a virtue at all. He redefines it based on how they actually behaved. It was a restless ambition, a vicious lust for sovereignty that consumed the human race with frightful ills. What they called glory was really just a sanitized, PR-friendly buzzword for the violent domination and subjugation of their neighbors. Augustine drops this absolute mic drop of a quote, demanding that we stop listening to the propaganda of the victors. He says, "Tear off the disguise of wild delusion and look at the naked deeds. Weigh them naked, judge them naked." Basically, don't look at the shiny triumphal arches and the beautiful marble statues. Look directly at the blood on the ground. So let's do exactly that. When we actually look at Rome's naked deeds, wow, the list is horrifying and completely stripped of any real virtue. Think about it. They built their early population by inviting their neighbors, the Sabines, to a festival and then literally stealing their women. Naturally, this forced them into bloody wars against their own new fathers-in-law. Later, they totally destroyed Alba Longa, which, remember, was their own ancestral mother city. During that very war, a Roman champion of the Herati slew his own sister just because she dared to weep for her slain fiancé, an enemy soldier. None of this was noble, virtuous defense. It was unnatural slaughter, driven entirely by that vicious lust for power. And hey, when real foreign threats did show up, the gods were nowhere to be found. Look at the Second Punic War against Hannibal. The disaster at the Battle of Cannae was so utterly devastating that Hannibal's forces collected 3 entire bushels of gold rings straight off the fingers of slaughtered Roman elites. 3 bushels. To put that into perspective, if the gods were the true guardians of Roman virtue and prosperity, they were spectacularly absent when it actually mattered most.
Let's head into Section 4, Peace Vying with Cruelty, the internal rot and civil carnage of the Republic. You know, even the era Roman historians often hyped up as their greatest rapidly descended into an absolute nightmare of civil bloodshed, which perfectly proves the internal rot of their society. It kicked off with the seditions of the Gracchi in 133 BC, where political reformers were just straight up murdered in the streets by the elite. This normalized political violence, and it spiraled into the devastating social wars, then the horrific urban massacres led by Marius, and finally Sulla's brutal proscriptions. They were systematically tearing themselves apart from the inside out.
Just look at Sulla's slaughter. He massacred 7,000 unarmed men who had already surrendered, executing them right there in the Villa Publica. And that was before he even published his notorious proscription list, which targeted 2,000 of Rome's highest elite for death so he could confiscate their property. The cruelty of Roman leaders against their own citizens in peacetime often far surpassed the savagery of foreign invaders like the Gauls.
And it wasn't just violence. The physical calamities didn't take a break during peacetime either. Down in Utica, a staggering pestilence wiped out an entire Roman garrison of 30,000 soldiers. Only 10 survived. 10 out of 30,000. This near-total wipeout happened squarely under the watch of the pagan gods, centuries before the Christian era even began.
Finally, Section 5, the final verdict. The gods were useless for earthly protection. Augustine essentially maps out the entire logical fallacy of his pagan contemporaries in these 4 steps. Step 1, willfully blame Christians for all the current disasters. Step 2, to pull that off, completely ignore centuries of your own pagan atrocities, plagues, and catastrophes. Step 3, continue to worship gods who, according to your own fables, actively demand and celebrate bloodshed and immorality. And Step 4, wrap up all this civil slaughter, greed, and destruction in a nice bow and simply call it glory. Augustine sums up this incredibly dark reality of the Roman Republic with a chilling thought. Peace vied with war in cruelty and surpassed it. For while war overthrew armed hosts, peace slew the defenseless. Under the Roman gods, their so-called virtue was quite often just a bloody mirage. The famous Pax Romana, that great Roman peace, was frequently nothing more than an era where citizens slaughtered each other in the streets. The gods couldn't stop it. In fact, the very culture they inspired directly encouraged it. So it really all comes down to this final, provocative thought. If Rome's gods couldn't stop a founding fratricide, if they couldn't prevent century after century of brutal civil war, plagues, and burning cities, why on earth would anyone trust them with the fate of an empire? Augustine's masterful explainer of Roman history forces us to look right past the grand statues and epic myths and stare directly at the uncomfortable historical truth. It really makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about the virtue and glory of ancient Rome, doesn't it?